Alex, what's happening? How are you?
Hey, how we doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for coming on today. I am excited to talk to you about something cool that I know is a passion project of yours, but also both of us been in the MBA space. I'm excited to just hear another person's perspective that is now in the private space. So thank you again for taking the time, and let's jump right into it and give a little bit of a background briefly into your experiences thus far. And I'll kind of segue a little bit of Apple, a little bit of MBA, now in the private space. So help us connect the dots between all of those.
For sure. I feel like I've been telling this story a lot recently, but I started my career as an athletic trainer. Never did that full time, but worked quite a bit of per diem after graduating up in Boston over a decade now. From there, I ended up working at Apple, which was, I always say, like the best accident that ever happened to me. Stayed there for 4 years. Knew I was always going to go back to PT school. I had played rugby in college, so I kind of transitioned at that point to working in the pro rugby space while also working as a strength coach, and then finally landed myself back in PT school and finished up and was very explicit and direct about my interest in working in the NBA and had a really lucky opportunity to spend some time in the NBA with two different teams and unexpectedly transition to the private side, which at the time I had no idea really existed, which obviously opened my mind quite a bit more. So a lot of kind of winding turns back and forth, but I've still, I say all the time that I wouldn't trade any of them. So my personal mantra is 99 by design. And it's kind of a play on like cats having nine lives and still being able to make it. Like 99 by design for me is I've lived 99 different lives. I was a live-in nanny. I worked at a wrap and smoothie shop, worked at Apple, worked at a healthcare tech company, worked in the NBA. My passion is really in healthcare, and the performance piece, but I've allowed my life to go a couple different directions. And I think all of them have contributed to why I'm able to do what I do today. So that's how we landed here in Scottsdale, Arizona.
Which is a beautiful place compared to this time of year out in Boston. So I'm sure you are not missing having to brush snow off your car.
Absolutely not. Tough transition
So,
to have, well, tough a little bit, I guess, to have no snow in the winter months, but my northeast side will probably feel better about that after a year.
well, you're welcome to drive up, 2, 3 hours, go up to Flagstaff, and even maybe, northeast Arizona. You'll get plenty of snow. So let's dive into the world of the NBA, which is, I know, a passion of yours for a couple different reasons. But before we do that, I want to kind of paint the story of working on both sides, because you worked on both the team side, you worked on the private consulting side. So I think it's important to get those perspectives, because for the longest time I worked on the team side, and you always had to interact with private practitioners like yourself. And every team, every organization, every team staff, private person handles that relationship differently. And it's important that we continue to build those relationships, because ultimately athletes, as they get more resources financially or elsewhere, they're going to continue to seek help beyond the team staff, because nowadays players are not staying with one team, they're constantly moving. So having outside people on their side is always helpful. So let's go into the team side first, and then we'll kind of transition out of it. So when you were working for the team side in the NBA, what was one of your favorite aspects of working with that team?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure plenty of people will say this, but there's a collaborative aspect of this that you don't get anywhere else. I mean, I think someone once said this to me around kind of career orientation is we look for impact and community. I think being on the team side gives you both of that. You have the community around, if you've ever seen the movie Ants, this is such a ridiculous reference, but I haven't watched that movie in like 10 years. But when I first got into the NBA, I'm watching everyone move around like they all have a purpose and they know what they're doing, and everyone's going different directions, but it seems like there's just this pace of life and also this expectation around everyone's doing something, everyone has a purpose, everyone has a role and responsibility, but they're not all necessarily going the same way. And that's not in a negative sense. It's everyone has something to be done in order to keep the show going. And that's kind of the other piece of it is I've always loved game day. And there's something really special about what we do on the sidelines. And I don't mean the literal sidelines, but I mean kind of behind the curtain of what we do from a health and performance perspective, how much goes into putting on a game when you really think about it. That stuff was so much fun. And obviously the travel piece. I always said that I wanted to travel for work, and I was going to try and figure out a way to integrate healthcare and travel. I don't think I anticipated what NBA travel actually meant, just from the volume of travel, the when of travel. I'm definitely appreciating a little bit of a change of that now, but that's kind of I think that's the big stuff. And being able to have shared responsibility around, you always have 5 or 6 other practitioners that you're able to talk through things with and be able to make decisions together, which really, people will think you have a lot of pressure when you work in a pro sport team environment. And certainly there is pressure, but that pressure looked a lot different than what I would have anticipated.
Can you elaborate more on that? When you say the pressure looked different, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. So the other day I was speaking with some PT students on the East Coast, and they were asking questions about, oh, well, did you ever feel afraid when you had to make a decision of a player can't play this game or a player has to play this other game, and what that felt to you? And as I reflected on what kind of pressure I felt when I was working in the team space, I never felt oh my gosh, I'm going to be in trouble if I make the wrong decision about this player playing or not. And the reason being because we had such a strong team atmosphere that I never felt like I was making that decision by myself. And that was a good thing. That didn't mean that I didn't have autonomy. It meant that we had such good alignment within our organization at the time that we were able to talk through things. So I never felt I'm alone, I'm here, and I'm going to make the right or wrong decision, but it's my call only. I think that also speaks to, again, what happens in a team environment, for better or for worse, is there are a lot of cooks in the kitchen, and there are a lot of people that things have to be run by when it comes to decision making, which can go really well if everyone's fairly well aligned, or also can be a challenge or obstacle. But it never felt like I'm alone making this decision, and that's an immense amount of pressure, if that makes sense.
1,000%. And and you eloquently navigated that very well, because that is a huge component or perspective that folks from the outside looking in perceive. And like you said, there are certain situations and certain times where, yeah, that pressure resides on you. It certainly does. There's moments like that. But then also, when you surround yourself, or the organization builds a great culture and brings in the right people, and you've worked with some great leaders and managers, when you do that effectively, it really does, like you brilliantly said, it disperses that pressure, and you're not alone, because nothing's worse of having a lot of pressure on you and you're alone on an island. It's terrible. It's not fun. It can
And don't
be.
get me wrong, it's not that you don't think about it, but it's less of this, 1+1 equation, because there's certainly a lot more that goes into a decision that gets made about a player playing or not. And certainly I think the media has influenced a lot of that for the excitement value of it. And obviously for both of us knowing what goes on behind the curtain, there's a lot more that goes into it than, the Woj bomb.
It's funny you bring up the Woj bomb, because there were certain moments during the trade deadline this past year. For those that aren't familiar, NBA trade line happens the week leading up to Super Bowl. So it's like an exciting time in the NBA as the NFL is rearing things up for the Super Bowl. What I was like, this is my first year being on the outside of the trade deadline. Typically, last several years I've been on the team, and I'm seeing all these notifications come through, or like all these reports, and I'm thinking to myself, gosh, those used to come flying all the time, and you would literally not think twice about it, because like that's such, like, there's no merit, there's no support behind that intern. Like, we all just know, like, that's just a big rumor for media attention. Now on the outside, I'm
Right.
like, wow, I don't know, is that true? Is it not true? But I know a good part of
Exactly.
it. A good part of it is
You
not
get
true.
sucked
But it's like,
in.
oh, I get, like, yeah, at this point, like, it does it. They do its job. So no, but hey, thank you for giving the perspective on the pressure side of things. And you mentioned, like, there's, it can be an obstacle, it can be a challenge. Like, aside from, let's just take pressure off the table, was there, like, being on the team side, like, reflecting back on your time, was there like a challenge you look at and you say, wow, like, that was just always there. There was always just an obstacle or a challenge that was just part of being in team sports. Is there anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, probably one of the biggest ones is you are rarely, if ever, running your A plan. And so, I think people that strive to work in professional sports, we all kind of strive to practice at the highest level, practice at the top of our licenses, have a really big impact, and we work extremely hard to be excellent at what we do. That evidences itself in that, I've had an opportunity to work with some of the smartest people. I've had the pleasure of being around, and incredible thinkers and creative people who are definitely at the highest level. And that was one of my interests in going into the NBA specifically. But then when you really start to peel back what goes on in professional sports, those are the challenges. Is you have this incredible A plan, and that starts to get kind of torn down. And I don't mean that in a totally negative way. That's just the reality of the same conversation around health is not performance. And that doesn't mean around making the wrong decision from a health perspective. It's how do we balance the priorities of all of those things. And at the end of the day, professional sports are also a business. And that's not to say some of the old school expectation around, we're just going to throw them out there when they're not ready. But the complexities around some of these decisions, the complexities around what the player wants, the complexities around the political game, the financial game, the front office game, the agent game, the player's family game, the winning the actual game of basketball. When you really start to look at all of those pieces, those challenges are very real. And that's not something that anyone can, I think, prepare you for. And it was not, I wouldn't say it was shocking, but it was a lot more of my job, and my thought process was around how to navigate some of those things. And then add in kind of something you already alluded to, where you have players that are getting moved around a lot more frequently, and players moving from one organization to the other. And having been fortunate to have worked for 2 different ones, and then worked on the private side for players who played for another 5 to 7 other organizations, you realize that there are 30 different entities in the NBA, and they have 30 different ways of doing things, sometimes night and day. And who's to say what's a better way or a worse way? Because it really depends on what are the priorities of the organization. And that started to reveal itself to me in a way that isn't about being a great physical therapist, and that isn't about being a great strength coach or athletic trainer. That's about having a business mind and understanding how businesses run, which for me was interesting, because I always say Apple is the best thing that ever happened to me by accident, but it really did allow me to understand a lot more about what goes on from the business side of things, and at least have some visibility to that to make sense of it, that otherwise I would have no idea what was going on.
I understand the magnitude of what you're saying, because I have a little bit more insights into what you did after team setting, what you're doing now. But part
Sure.
of what you're doing, that in between was you were consulting with individual athletes, professional athletes. And so you went from the team side to then being still supporting players on the team side, to then supporting players privately. And because you have that perspective, like you just alluded to, you saw how all 30 teams potentially can do things slightly different, and yet it still works. So when you made that transition into the private space, what was some of the things you enjoyed about that, and also like some of the obstacles you faced there too?
Yeah. And people always ask me the question of, oh, well, which one did you prefer? And I really can't say one over the other. It really depends on what lens you're asking me. But to answer your question around the private side, some of the upsides obviously are the simplicity of it. At the end of the day, the only person I have to truly answer to is the player that I am working for, because at that point, they're the ones that are paying my salary. They're the ones that are asking me to be potentially brutally honest with them about what they need or what they should do. And I felt a lot more freedom to be able to have some of those conversations, because for the most part, I'm the only one having those conversations with them. And, so I think sometimes, because we societally associate height with age, we forget that a lot of these NBA guys are kids, and they came into the league and their lives changed substantially, both from a financial perspective, but also just from an overall lifestyle perspective, at a time when maybe they weren't necessarily fully prepared to handle that. And I don't know if them being older would have changed that either, because I think it's very hard for anyone to handle a lot of those changes. But having some of these conversations and recognizing, oh, okay, I'm maybe the first person to have some of these conversations with them, and I have the luxury and the privilege of being kind of in their space, in their world. I'm traveling with them, and I might be the only person that's ever traveled with them, and I see how they travel. And I mean that from the standpoint of, how much time do you spend on a plane across the country where you haven't stood up? And when you're 6 foot 9 or above, those legs don't like to sit that long. And it's like like little reminders like that. They're not thinking about that stuff. And on one hand, I don't want to be nagging them, but on the other hand, it's like, hey, you just sat in a plane for 6 hours. Maybe don't go straight to the court right now. Maybe we go do something else first, or little stuff like that. So the luxury of that piece of being able to really unpack, what do people do when they walk out of the team facility? Who are they when they're in their own space? What are their, behind the mask personalities? That part was fantastic because it allowed me to really get to know players on a different level and have a better impact around what do you actually want. Because at the end of the day, going to an NBA facility, that is part of your job. And so who you are when you walk into the facility, a lot of times it can still be genuine, but potentially a little bit more guarded and a little bit more protective, especially for guys that have moved around through the league. So the private side allowed me to see a lot more of the authenticity of these guys. But on the other hand of things, not as many resources, a lot of times getting really creative about my whole treatment approach or where we were going to train, even more so than just generally training in hotels. Like we're, thinking, okay, well, if we have this amount of time, we're flying commercial to this place and we arrive at this time. Do we have the shoes that we need? In the team environment, someone's taking care of the shoes. And I can only be responsible for so many things, but having to be responsible for a lot more. And then again, going from okay, if this is the A plan, because I have every resource, to, okay, what is the B plan or the B plus plan? What does that look like? What are the minimum pieces of technology that I want to bring to be able to get the outcomes that we're looking for? Okay, that continues to change it. So it made me kind of leverage my brain in a different way and open my eyes too to what do players actually want from their practitioner, and does that align with what I think they need? And was that the same experience in the team setting? A lot of times it wasn't, and that was probably more eye-opening than I expected it to be.
Was there you alluded to some challenges on the team side. I think you may have touched on them, but I want to ask the question directly. What challenges did you face in the private space in comparison to the team side?
Yeah, certain organizations are more difficult to communicate with than others. And like I said, having been on the team side, I get it because not all practitioners are on the same page. And that goes both ways. And it's very hard when you have so many people involved to have a lot of conversations. So I was trying to look for what is the best outcome for this player right now? And, I sometimes talked myself all the way out of a job. If it made more sense for the player to work with the organization, whether that be politically, resource wise, what is the best care plan for this athlete right now? And sometimes that was, you should work with the organization. And that makes way more sense for you to do that, whether that be in season or off season or for a particular trip or something like that. I was lucky because the last organization that I worked with on the private side, I had a great relationship with. And there would be times where we would have conversations and it would be, okay, hey, here's what I want to do with this athlete. And me and the practitioner would have a great conversation, and I would not change the plan, whether I fully agreed with it or not, because I knew that based on this athlete's personality, the best thing that I could do is be aligned. And that part, while it's, easy from a communication standpoint, it is still challenging because that was my full-time job. And being responsible for one athlete is also hard from the standpoint of you can only think so much about them in a day, and how do you handle some of the changes that go on in a day, whether they want you to work with them that day or not. That part's hard too. And you're relying on them for communication from what's going on within the team setting. And I don't get to see it with my own eyes, which I think I didn't credit how much I was privy to what was going on just by being in the team side.
Yeah, there's a lot that goes on the team side that, like you said, unless you've lived it, you'll never appreciate or understand. And that's why I just think it's so cool getting your perspective, because you've seen both. And I think that's what's led you to this passion project of yours, that because you have that experience of private team, understanding kind of the, for lack of better words here, politics that go into it. You are really trying to support players holistically in alongside, like establishing that partnership with teams. So I'd really love to double click into this passion project of yours, because we've set the stage here to really jump into it, to give credibility and understand like, hey, here's someone that's lived both sides, and here's what we're seeing. Here's some success. Here's some failures. Here's how we can make it better. You want to make it better. How do we do that?
Yeah. So I think to really give an idea of what my NBA career has looked like, I was on the team side with one team. I went to the private side. It was originally just supposed to be for an off season that turned into a little bit of a longer term consulting relationship. Went back into the team side for a shorter contract with a very high profile player, which really opened my eyes differently around what the team side was like, and then went back into the private side again. Through that time, I got an opportunity to work with probably close to 50 NBA players under some short term or longer term relationship. But the perspectives kind of changed a lot because I got to see at every different angle from guys who I met at the combine and had a chance to kind of help through their draft process, all the way up to a player who's very high profile at the top of the NBA. So it really gave me this, oh, okay, I have this huge collection of data points around how different players behave, what are some commonalities, what are some differences, how two different organizations operate. And that was the thing. If I hadn't worked in a second organization, I don't think I would have appreciated how different teams can be. And I'm sure you kind of can speak to this as well. But the passion project that you're alluding to is around the partnership between teams, players, the Players Association, and how we create better relationships between all three for players and organizations to have the best outcomes and get the most out of, I want to say like the most out of what they paid for, but not in the way of this player as a commodity, but in the way of, okay, how can we protect the interests of all parties? So what I'm looking to do is establish some of that by being a conduit for the private side, because there are a lot of practitioners who work privately with players who have not worked in the team setting before. And while they're probably incredible practitioners, especially when players choose to work with them and pay out of pocket to see them, there are certain things that it's hard for them to understand why they're being met with either a lack of communication, limitations in communication, or different priorities than maybe they're used to when they're seeing this athlete. And from the team side, going to the private side, how can we support private practitioners, especially in something like the off season, to be able to support these athletes? Because when we are on the team side, these people can be our greatest assets and our eyes and ears through the off season to make sure the player is getting not only what they want, but also what they need and what our expectations are when they come back at the end of the off season. So looping in the Players Association, I think that's kind of where this lives. And I've been fortunate to have a good relationship with them as well and look into what they're doing from a sports medicine perspective and being able to partner with them to ask questions around, okay, if this scenario comes up when a player gets traded, what happens? If a player wants to see their medical information, what is the process? If a player is looking for support moving their family to the next city that they got traded to, what does that look like? And so it definitely goes beyond the health and performance piece, but it's creating some sort of unified alignment around moving players through the system and helping them have the best careers, but also being able to support the changing in organizations and the reorientation to what those priorities are.
One thing I want to share with you and share with the audience. I want to just, you tell me know if you agree with this statement. I had one player I worked with. He had an entourage. Let me just call it. He had an entourage. Great team. Right, well established player, deserved to have that. Had started to change teams. And one day I just we're going through his routine in the weight room, and I asked him, hey man, like what made you decide that you needed to have this support outside? Because like we've got great people here, and like you love working with everyone that's here. It's like why do you have someone outside? And it really resonated. He said, Adam, like when I get traded, you're not coming with me, flat out. He's like,
Yeah.
And when I get traded, what you do here is not going to be the same thing that the physical therapist I work with on another team is going to do. So for my own continuity of care in my career, I need to make sure that I'm doing the same things consistent that work for me. And hearing it come from him really just gave me an appreciation, because when you live the space, you're aware of it, you know it. But having the courage to ask him one day, and I'm so glad I did, because it really shifted my perspective on it. Because for a while, you're always hesitant on the folks on the other side that aren't on the team. You're like, are you just trying to leverage this player for your own marketing? Like that is always, especially the NBA athlete. The
100%.
NBA athlete is such a marketable athlete. But hearing like once I heard it from him, and then you spend the time to get to know folks like yourself, right? It's not just a matter of like, hey, let's just share treatment plans. It's like, no, like let's try and understand each other a little bit more, develop that relationship. It makes total sense. The nowadays of I think the only player I can think of right now that's been at a team long term is like Booker with the Suns, and I think you're hard pressed to find players that are staying with one team where they could potentially have
Yep.
continuity. So hearing you talk about trying to build a relationship so that we can have some continuity when players move around, or having some standard practices of like the combine is great, everyone goes through something similar. Well, shouldn't there be some standards across? I don't know, maybe I'm being hypothetical here, but shouldn't there should be some standards across medical care as well if we're
And
doing the same thing on the combine side?
you're hitting a lot of the things that inspired this for me. Like I said, I didn't know when I got asked if I was interested in a job in the private space, I didn't know it existed. And once I got into it, I was like, well, a lot more players spend some amount of money on private support. Not as many full time, but certainly with new TV deals and changing contracts, that might change because the money is seemingly only going up. But the player that you're talking about who had an entourage and that conversation that you had, if I'm that player, or if I'm a player in the NBA, knowing what I know now, I'm also, why wouldn't I hire my own people if I have the means to do it? And that's not because I don't trust organizations or they're trying to ruin my career. It's the continuity piece. I'm a professional. And that's the thing that I think speaks to those types of players. It's how can we be upset with them for wanting to do something like that? Because that to me demonstrates an element of professionalism in taking care of your career. And it is sometimes challenging because those entourages or those people aren't always open minded, and vice versa. But that's where culturally I see an opportunity for there to be a little bit of a shift to take the onus off of, I'm using me, but like the collective of the private practitioner or the collective of the organization, and let it live somewhere where there is an organization whose responsibility is primarily for the protection and elevation of the players, and that would be within the union, because that is where their job is to mediate and mitigate some of those pieces. And this isn't to say that they haven't tried to do it in the past. It's super hard. And there are not a lot of people who have gone in and out of team setting, private setting, team setting again, and traveled as if I was in an NBA team, which that was too much travel. I got my wish and it was too much travel, but I got to see things in a very high density period of time. That's like, oh, I think there are a lot of really good people who are trying to do really great work for whoever it is they work for. And there has to be a better way, because right now it's in this kind of funny space where more players are hiring their own people. Obviously you and I both have opportunities to continue to work with players in that space, whether we're on the inside or outside. But okay, we all are aligned around certain goals and we're trying to do a lot of the same stuff. We can do this better.
So let's ask the $1 million question here. Like, what is the ideal state that you hope we get to in, let's say, 5 years?
Come on, that's my $1 million business idea. um, I I think that you touched on this with having standards, and that doesn't necessarily need to mean standards of practice, but I think there should be a forum for private practitioners, whether that be them to communicate with each other or communicate with the organizations. But I think there's a way to allow for that space to exist. I think spaces like the combine and through kind of draft process and potentially different parties getting a little bit more involved in, okay, well, what are the accepted standards of practice for Y or Z, and where do they currently live, and having that be available within the NBA space for practitioners who have been there for a long time, to kind of see into, but also, okay, where do these conversations get mediated? So I like the idea of there being a third party who has nothing to do with anyone in the conversation, to mediate the conversation. And that's not to say that these conversations get heated and are horrible, but it's very difficult when you're coming from your side of the fence, basically. And I've made this mistake many times where, well, I don't even want to call it a mistake, but I've gone through the challenge of I want to do something or I want to say something and I have to say something to a player because I disagree with what is being said to them on the other side. And my job is to do that for them because they've hired me. I wish that there was a third party to help mediate the conversation because I don't want to negatively impact their career by going to an organization and saying I disagree with them if I don't have a great relationship with them, because then that organization might not want to be my partner anymore. But I also don't want to tell my player that I'm working for that I don't disagree with something that's being said to them or that I agree when I don't. So then how do I navigate some of that stuff? So I certainly feel like there isn't one right way to do it, but I like the idea of some sort of third party facilitation and certainly some standards, but this is way easier said than done. And I think it's going to take a long time, but I guess I'll give you my final thought on that. I like the idea of players being better advocates for their own care. So I know the Players Association has quite a few initiatives that they're running through from a sports medicine perspective, whether that be something called the Sanctuary. So it's the health and performance facility located in Spain that goes on every summer and it's available during the year it's supposed to be a sanctuary, but it's an opportunity for players to get a little bit more involved, come train, see kind of what's going on within the Players Association. But there are pieces like having an EMR that players have access to. So an electronic medical record system that players can access themselves. And I don't know if this has been your experience as well, but nothing is scarier to me than when a player is extremely disengaged from their own healthcare. And they just say, oh, no, it's okay. Whatever you tell me, I'm going to listen to. Because at least to me, short term, that can be really rewarding. But long term, it's like, okay, well, that's very volatile to me. I want players to understand, okay, this is, if they have an ankle sprain, let's use the easiest example. This is the process of what a return to play should look like. It might look a little different how this gets delivered, but I need you to understand what the expectations are around this should be XYZ period of time. And when we educate them and allow them more choice and engagement with how their healthcare gets delivered, I think ultimately they're the ones that are going to drive some of these changes to be made. And it isn't just about the Joe Schmo off the street they tried to hire, or their friend, or this practitioners they found, or the person at the team that they wanted to take with them or not. But it's around, well, they have more informed decision making. And at the end of the day, it is a players' league, and I think we can leverage them to help drive this forward.
Amen. What it's the as you were talking, the example of players saying, yeah, tell me what to do and I'm good, versus the player that knows exactly what they want. Both have their pros and cons, but you're right. The one that just shows up and says, yeah, just do whatever you guys say. Sometimes can be a challenge as well, because you're like, well, is this working for you? Are you seeing the results? Like, do you know what's going on? And then, if you don't have someone like yourself who's advocating for them, then the question becomes, well, is actually what you're doing even good for you, right? So it's like I hear the challenge that it can be when you have the athlete that may or may not have much interest in understanding.
Yeah, and that's not to say, obviously, I'm sure we've all worked with the athletes that ask us 500 questions and want to know every single piece of the anatomy and the thought process, and I don't mind that at all. I like it. And then we have the person that asks no questions, and you're like, okay, this is where I wish that you asked a couple more questions, or I wish that you were interested in. And this is where I go back to my time at Apple was extremely impactful to me, because it gave language to skills that I already had, but it also made me realize areas of communication that I could build on. And it gave me better language to describe situations I perceived in human interaction. And what I mean by that is we had this saying, perception is reality. And there is, I think, no better place for that than in an NBA training room, because whether it be that I've performed some sort of voodoo and, told this player something or did something that they think works, and all of a sudden they think that this is the best thing that ever happened, or I, do something that they are uncomfortable with because they had a bad experience with it. Let's use dry needling. Very polarizing topic in the NBA space, just from a player perspective. You get guys that want to be needled in places that I don't think that I should needle. And then you get guys that are like, please don't touch me with anything that even looks like a needle ever at all, because I'm going to freak out, but yet they're covered in tattoos, myself included. It's like, whether it works or not, it's like their perception of something. Maybe they got needled one time and somebody placed a needle and they got zinged, and now they never want to be needled again because they think needling is the problem. We need to respect those pieces. And that was probably the thing that was most adjusted in my mind as I moved through the pro sport space, is that their perception of things is the number one reality. What I represent, if I work for the organization or if I work privately for them, even when me and the person on the private side or me and the person on the team side are saying the same thing, their perception matters.
100%. I love the training room analogy.
Yes.
Throw some voodoo on it and it's going to work. No, but it's so true.
And
though.
you know what? Sometimes it does, but
hey, I'm with you. It works. I want to be mindful of your time. I know you got some more clients coming in the rest of today. So the final question I want to round out here, because you've had this diverse background of Apple, private team, you've also worked with some elite people, not even just the NBA athlete. I think you've had some great lessons along the way. And I was just wondering if you had any like key lessons that came to mind that you'd be willing to share with the audience. Because if they're looking to, make a small change to their own health and performance, learn from someone that's been around a lot of great stuff, what advice would you have for them?
I got two for you. So one, and this is something that I'm still working on, which is to, one, be where your feet are, but be where your feet are from the standpoint of, if you're going to run a plan or if you're going to try to do something, do that thing and measure it or monitor it, or let yourself do the thing, whether that be how you're trying to learn something, how your training goes, how your health and nutrition are going. Don't try and make all of these changes. And so what I mean by that is like tuning out the noise and being wherever you are. So pick a direction, go that direction, but go at it to the best of your abilities. And that, like I mean, from a professional standpoint and a personal standpoint, that has been something I'm actively trying to work on. And I have seen the fruits of my labor in that area. And I think the other one is, this one's more professionally, whatever you believe, stand on it. And when I say that, I mean, if you don't feel confident standing on what you say, you need to reevaluate why you believe a certain thing. And that has also been something that's come up quite a bit. Why do I believe certain methods of training or methods of treatment? And it's allowed me to go down rabbit holes a little bit more and be more curious, especially now that I've moved into a private space, but I am in one location role. So my variety of athletes has been a bit different, both in sport and demographics. So it has changed the opportunities that I have to decide, okay, well, if I'm going to use this intervention or if I'm going to go down this road of thinking, why do I actually think that? But to be confident in the thing that I am choosing.
I second the latter. There are some people I've interacted with in the private space. I was on the team side. And the one lesson I can look back and say, that's why you're successful, is what they said they believed wholeheartedly. Even if I disagreed with her, even if I thought it wasn't the best solution to this answer, they stood on it they dug their heels in, they stood on it, they defended it, and they're like, and that's what players need sometimes. That's what your client needs sometimes. That's what the athlete needs.
Absolutely.
It's like, hey, they just need to know someone's got me, and they're not unwavering, and their confidence just radiates. And so I really just appreciate you calling that out, because I've seen it and lived it, and it's so true, and it's important. And listen, at the end of the day, if you got to pivot and adjust, that's totally cool. Like, that's what makes it great. That's what makes people great, is they learn, wow, for 2 years I was doing this and I was wrong. I can say that, and now I'm going to believe this and stand on it.
Yeah.
Well, hey, this was fantastic. I appreciate your time. If people want to get in touch with you, learn a little bit more, is there a place we can point them for you?
Yes. Instagram is probably the easiest place to find me. My handle is AFHOOGZ. The nickname is a story for another time, but yeah, that's probably the easiest way to find me. And I'll share my email address in the show notes for you as well.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks for joining on today, and we'll catch up soon.
All right. Talk to you soon, Adam.